morning, everyone. Welcome to the fifth and final day of our Knowledge for Prevention online symposium. We'll just give a moment for everybody to be joined in to allow the various participants from all over the world to join us. Welcome, everyone. Good morning. Welcome to the fifth and final day of our 2020 Knowledge for Prevention online symposium. My name is Shelly Whitman, and I am the Executive Director of the Dallaire Institute for Children, Peace, and Security.
Hello, can you hear me?
Before we begin today's session, we would like to acknowledge that the Dallaire Institute and Dalhousie University are located in Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq. When we discuss reconciliation here in Canada and around the globe, it is up to all of us to remember the role we have to play. Firstly, in learning about and actively listening to our Indigenous peoples when they raise their voices on the injustices that they have faced and continue to face. And secondly, in committing to making a change that goes beyond words or lip service towards tangible and concrete action. Systemic racism is an issue that remains far too prevalent in all of our societies. And let me be clear, Canada is no exception. This week alone, we have seen countless examples of how our own internal systems have failed our Indigenous peoples across this country. So, as we reflect on the discussions that we have had online this week, there is one thread that remains particularly clear to me, that every child matters. I would ask that all of us tuning in here today be mindful of our own internal biases and self-perceptions, and perhaps ask ourselves the following questions. When we talk about global child protection, is there a certain image that comes to mind? Why as a society do we value the protection of some children over others? And what can we do better to ensure that all children are prioritized equally and that no child is ever left behind? It is within this context that I would like to introduce today's panel. While the recruitment and use of children in conflict is an evolving and a growing global problem, reliable and timely information to inform prevention efforts have been lacking up till now. In order to break cycles of violence and progressively end the recruitment and use of children, the world has to focus on prevention. And that includes effective early warning to inform early and collaborative action, tangible approaches to making change. Yet, there are currently no effective early warning systems that take into account consideration of the recruitment and use of children as soldiers as a key indicator. This, despite the number and intensity of conflicts where children are used globally. This represents a critical gap within both research and policy domains in terms of understanding the current and evolving risk factors that precede recruitment and better ways for us to address how to prevent conflict overall. The current lack of predictive ability means policymakers, security sector actors, humanitarians, and academics as well, are also in a situation where we are largely reacting to the recruitment and use of children. This, as opposed to prioritizing the prevention of violations against children and the prevention of endemic cycles of conflict. We need to think of this from a far more strategic consideration and understand how to operationalize that in a day-to-day fashion. The longer we wait to take action during a crisis, the more costly the intervention becomes, not only for children, but also for the security sector actors who are often either the first point of contact or being used as peacekeepers, and then the communities as a whole. This session aims to demonstrate the importance of early warning to not only child protection, but to conflict prevention fields. We need to consider best practices to effectively translate early warning into early action. This is at the heart of the K4P research project and why we are striving to accomplish a predictive ability to better protect children from the traumas of participating in armed conflict and violence. It is also this particular aspect of why I am so pleased to be able to introduce so many of the incredible people we have here with us today, but in particular, my colleague, Dr. Baillie Abidi. She is here to provide an overview of the K4P research project and the development of our predictive model on the recruitment and use of children as soldiers. I thank Catherine for all of the hard work that she's been putting into this, as well as many of our other colleagues on the research team. And I would also like to thank Tim Lyman, who has been our statistician that has been working with us over the last couple of years. And I would also like to thank Bruce McKean, our major donor on this particular project. So Catherine, the floor is now yours.
Thanks, Shelly. I think we're just going to pull up a PowerPoint here. Great, thank you. So thanks, Shelly. As Shelly has said, recruitment and use of children is an evolving and growing global problem. Unfortunately, reliable and timely information about recruitment is lacking, and it's lacking greatly. The need for improved prevention mechanisms inspired our current project called Knowledge for Prevention, or K4P. The K4P project was launched in February 2019, and there's 3 primary areas of focus. There we go. So the first element of our K4P project is to develop a predictive model of child soldier recruitment. The second element is to work with our colleagues who are working in other early warning systems of conflict prevention to ensure that children are a central element, a central indicator, a central consideration for how we're looking at preventing future conflicts. And the third element is looking at how we can share our information, our lessons observed and learned together to create a better system of protection for children. I want to thank, first of all, our K4P community of practice, our 2 advisory boards, our team at the Dallaire Institute, and particularly, as Shelly has stated, our data scientist, Tim Lyman, for helping us to evolve this important work. We're making progress on the development of our predictive model to enable security and humanitarian actors to flag increased recruitment at an earlier stage, which in turn could help better inform preventative measures to protect children. Today, I'm going to do a brief overview of some of the main elements of our predictive model, and we look forward to future opportunities to collaborate with partners to improve this work. Early interventions of recruitment are far more effective than reactive responses. They disable the propensity of a group to continue targeting children, as well as prevent children and communities from the devastating impacts of the use of children as soldiers. Applying the predictive model will assist those in the security fields and in humanitarian fields and policymakers and community leaders to act with collective understanding of what the drivers are for recruitment so that we could take different actions to prevent this from occurring. We need timely and effective action to prevent recruitment. The early warning system has to be coupled with the identification of key leverage points of intervention that are appropriate to the situation and the context. So while we appreciate that recruitment is diverse, it looks different in different regions, there are gender dynamics of recruitment. We are looking at recruitment as along a continuum. First, looking at the basic propensity to recruit children. So what are the normalizations? What are the conditions that enable even the thought or the beginning synergies to enable children to be active in violence? Then moving through contemplation to emerging. What are the systems and the environmental factors that are enabling children to be actively engaged in conflict, through to the final element of a systemic use of children. So our early warning system is looking more at the likelihood in the contemplation era, looking at how we can stop recruitment and prevent at a much earlier stage, but also to identify opportunities for intervention at different stages of this emerging through to systemic recruitment practice. Our early warning system is focused on the likelihood of child soldier use. Our current prototype model is reasonably accurate, and we're looking forward to having the opportunity to practice and apply the model to improve its usability. We are currently able to predict child soldier use 86% of the time. We are also currently looking to enhance our ability to predict not recruitment. So the ability to predict when children are recruited is equally important to our ability to predict when children will not be recruited. Our prototype model was created using Hare and Bolmalt's data, and we thank them very much for the access to this data. We have found the following indicators are the most significant in terms of our understanding of a predictive ability, and that is the conflict duration, whether the conflict was a coup, and whether government forces are using children. So these are indicators we're looking at with particular attention. Our early warning modeling is embedded in a process that sees warning and the resulting action as inseparably linked. We need to know what we will do with the warning before we get it. And the early warning model needs to know how its results will inform action, what action options are, and how early warning monitoring systems can result and inform action decisions. Our early warning model will be used to make predictions at regular intervals of the likelihood of child soldier recruitment and use in emerging contexts in every context. The system will predict 1 to 2 years into the future based on the best data that we have available at the time. We see this as the minimum early warning window to provide time for validating the predictions and developing intervention strategies where appropriate. Our system requires 2 main actors, one being the watchers, people who can flag areas of concern, time of concern, indicators of concern, and then the interveners, people who are prepared to step in and enact preventative action. Our early warning model, we anticipate to have a dashboard that will help give us early indications of areas of concern. We are aiming for country level predictions to be evaluated with on the ground partners from each country so that we have a high likelihood of child soldier recruitment and use prediction for a particular period. The validation process will help us make decisions about whether we wait, whether we have to watch more closely or ask more questions, or whether we begin intervention with colleagues. The interventions that we foresee are focused on building community resilience to recruitment, addressing underlying factors that make recruitment more likely, and engaging with armed actors to reduce the likelihood of recruitment. In essence, our predictions serve to highlight countries where the Dallaire Institute and our partners need to pay close attention, where we need to flag areas of concern for action. Our preliminary modeling is showing very promising results, despite being constrained by a lack of data on child soldier recruitment. The modeling not only predicts child soldier use well, but also supports the identification of generic interventions that could reduce the likelihood of child soldier use. We are now developing our own core data set to demonstrate evidence of the use of child soldiers by any armed group in any country between the years of 2010 and 2019. This will be a flagship product for the Dallaire Institute to be able to improve our modeling and to demonstrate where we envision the likelihood of children being recruited and used. We are beginning to test this model with colleagues in South Sudan this year, and we look forward to all the learning that enables us to have. Together, we have a mutual responsibility to prioritize prevention, and I'm looking forward to learning from our colleagues today. Thanks, Shelly.
Thank you, Catherine. So we're really grateful for that overview that was done so exceptionally well. I want to now take the opportunity to introduce our first panelist for today. We are excited to be sharing all of this work with you and all of you joining us here today, and I'm sure that the panel discussions will be instrumental for us to further advance this work. I'm now pleased to introduce Dr. Siobhan O'Neil. Siobhan is the project director of the Managing Exits from Armed Conflict project at the Center for Policy Research at the United Nations University. She was previously project lead for UNU's Children and Extreme Violence Project and Disarmament, Demobilization, and Reintegration Project Manager. Prior to joining UNU, Siobhan was a consultant at the UN Mine Action Service, providing strategic guidance and program support for key mine action programs in Mali and Palestine. Siobhan has experience in both the security and intelligence fields. In the wake of the 11th of September 2001 attacks, she worked for the newly created state Homeland Security agencies in New York and New Jersey, where she helped state and local governments build their capacity to detect, prevent, and recover from terrorist attacks. She later served as the analyst for domestic security and intelligence at the Congressional Research Service, identifying emerging threats and evaluating possible policy responses for Congress. During the course of her doctoral studies, Siobhan worked as a research analyst at the RAND Corporation on projects pertaining to counterinsurgency transitions, insurgent motivations, and civil-military coordination during domestic, chemical, biological, radiological, nuclear, and explosive attacks. I want to also recognize that we've worked with Siobhan in some of her incredible work that she has been doing over the past few years, and through our collaboration with UNICEF and others related to the Paris Principles Steering Group. I'm so pleased to have her with us today. So Siobhan, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thanks, Shelly. Thank you to everyone at Dallaire for organizing this really important event, not only this panel, but this broader course of work that you're leading. And I think really harnessing our attention on prevention, which is so essential in this space and does not get as much attention or resources as it should. And I think to do prevention well, all of the people represented, and I've kind of scrolled through the participant list and see a lot of names I know and the different communities they represent. Prevention requires a really holistic response from a lot of people. So I think this is really indicative of what's needed in this space. So while we recognize prevention is really important, and for prevention we need prediction. So this is, I think, very, very apt to this discussion. Prediction is really hard. Prevention is really hard. There's a lot of discussion, I think, in the more securitized space about individual level prediction, which is deeply problematic. And I'm very happy that the approach that's being just discussed here is much more at a community or aggregate national level. But that's still hard as well. And it still comes with a lot of challenges. Any data-driven model is only as good as the data it's based on. And the data we have on child recruitment in many places is problematic. It is problematic, I think, from a visibility, accessibility standpoint, a coverage standpoint, and then a lot of this data is aggregated. And so it makes it difficult within a conflict to understand sort of where you're seeing recruitment geographically necessarily, or within groups. So you could think, or within conflicts. You can think about Syria, where estimates put the minimum number of groups at over 1,000. So how do you then understand where you need to harness your resources in a preventive effort? And to do prediction, you need to continue to collect quality data with extensive coverage. So this is really important, I think, to raise awareness about the need for improved data collection in this space to make sure that we can do this kind of predictive modeling. This kind of systematic, rigorous, and transparent data, transparently collected. I mean, another challenge that we see in this space is that the data that we do have not only was it not intended for this purpose, it was collected for other reasons, but we don't know a lot about decisions behind its coding. And so it's very hard to evaluate it at times. So we really need that transparent, systematic, and rigorous data in this space. To do this well, and Catherine just mentioned it, the goal is to have this 1 to 2 years out window. But that also requires data to be collected in a particular way. And in some cases, especially with certain types of armed groups, recruitment may not work on that kind of timeline. And so how do we do this in a way that we ensure that practitioners get these early warnings in time to actually make a difference, and have some clarity on where to target their resources? I think, as I mentioned, we need more and better data in this space, but there is also existing data collected for other reasons that could potentially be harnessed to make sure we're not completely duplicating efforts. So you could think about things like the MRM, which has its own challenges, but again, when you're pulling as much as you can to try to make this as strong an effort as possible. I think the next question is, once you have this information, what do you do with it? So going from information to action. And I think there, it's important to recognize a couple things. One, the research that we've done in this space suggests that the same conditions and factors that make children vulnerable for child recruitment into armed groups and armed forces also make them vulnerable for all kinds of negative outcomes, whether it's trafficking, exploitative labor. And so the question is, when we start to see these warning signals that potentially we have the conditions that are ripe for this, do we do interventions that also address this broader vulnerability to adverse outcomes? And I think that's really important. And there's been so much work in this space that's quite narrow, focused on child involvement in armed conflict and specific interventions with that population historically, and that's shifted over time, or very focused on that particular experience, not recognizing, I think, the broader conditions and certainly post-involvement, the daily stresses that those children and youth they have on a day-to-day basis, and what that makes them vulnerable for, whether it's re-recruitment or something else. And so thinking about how you tailor or expand the interventions to address that broader vulnerability issue. On the issue of prevention, of different leverage points that we potentially have in this space, certainly Dallaire and its work working with state forces, I think, is extremely important. And then there's this question of whether other types of armed actors, particularly armed groups, particularly when there's a lot of armed groups, particularly when they don't have hierarchical structures, well-known, known command, whether they have geographically different local commanders doing very different things. What do we know about preventive efforts with those types of organizations? What works, what doesn't? How do we make sure that we don't cause harm? How do we document this along the way so we build up a better body of knowledge on how to do this effectively? How do we action this as a community, a really broad community? So where are capacities and resources, and who has sort of leverage points about making a difference in this space? And so how do you make sure that you marshal that once you do have these early warnings? All of this to say that this is difficult. And just because it's difficult doesn't mean it doesn't have to be done. It does have to be done. It's extremely important, and prevention is always, I think Shelly said this, but it's less expensive, and the human toll is much better than responding to something while it's already happening. And that is definitely what we're hearing. That is the call to action, is prevention, but how do we do it well? How do we do it as a community? How do we do it based on evidence? How do we do it in a way that we have enough time to respond effectively? So even though I've raised, I think, some challenges for us, I think that it's quite clear that we need to be moving in this space. And there's a lot of people on this call who can help problem solve some of these issues, and how we can come together to really create that robust predictive mechanism. So I want to thank Dallaire for their leadership in this space, for the call to arms to focus on prevention, and for giving us this initial tool and effort to move to a predictive capacity. So thank you for letting me join you today.
Thank you very much, Siobhan. Thank you for your presentation. And thank you for the very thoughtful points that you've raised about the importance of the data collection and the early warning to early action. I want to take the opportunity now to introduce our next speaker, a longtime friend of the Dallaire Institute, Dr. Walter Samah. Walters is a conflict resolution specialist and governance expert with several years of experience conducting training for a wide range of stakeholders. That includes legislators, local authorities, traditional leaders, uniformed officers, armed opposition groups, and civil society representatives. He is currently the head of the Mission Analysis Cell of the UN-mandated African Union mission in Somalia. He provides strategic analysis and advisory support to the mission in the implementation of its mandate. He is also a member of the joint AU-UN subject matter experts in charge of delivering pre-deployment training to AMISOM's troop and police contributing countries, including Kenya, Uganda, Ethiopia, Djibouti, Burundi, Nigeria, Sierra Leone, and Ghana. The pre-deployment package delivered to the troops includes key compliance-related cross-cutting themes such as IHL and IHRL, child protection, protection of civilians, conduct and discipline, sexual exploitation and abuse, and conflict-related sexual violence. I would also like to take the opportunity to note that Walters has worked with our child protection advisor in Somalia for several years, is a trained trainer for the Dallaire Institute, and has been working with us in countries such as the DRC. Previously, he worked as a mediator and dialogue facilitator for the Danish Refugee Council in Central Africa, parliamentary strengthening specialist for USAID in Haiti, and civil affairs officer for the UN Stabilization Mission in Haiti. Before launching his international career more than a decade ago, Dr. Samah taught in colleges and universities in Cameroon. He holds an MA in political science and a doctorate in history of international relations from the University of Yaoundé in Cameroon. Welcome, Walters. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Shelly. And let me use this opportunity to thank the Dallaire Institute for inviting me to participate in this very important symposium. I'm participating here on a personal capacity. In fact, I've followed the events over the past 4 or 5 days, and I really want to use this opportunity to commend the organizers, for putting together such great panelists throughout since the start of the event. What I particularly like about the K4P concept, it is focused on prevention, and which he hopes to achieve through a dual approach, that of mainstreaming child protection within, or child soldier recruitment prevention within the early warning systems that exist. And also it hopes to have a standalone mechanism, early warning mechanisms, focusing specifically on child soldier recruitment and youth. I think, in my view, this really helps to fill 2 existing gaps, and I think achieving that objective would go a long way to addressing the critical problem of child soldier recruitment in situations of armed conflict. Now, my brief presentation will focus on how early warning can be effectively translated into early action to better protect vulnerable children across the world. I will try to address the topic by asking some thought-provoking questions as well, which in my view will help all of us panelists, decision makers, to interrogate our assumptions when it comes to regarding the practice of child soldier recruitment. And what does early action really means? Should it be applied only to prevention when a conflict breaks out? Or should that also cover other phases of intervention, such as a response and the remedial action? Now, more importantly, why is early action for prevention not followed by early action? why is early warning not triggering early action? Why, in spite so many indicators, so many signals of child soldier recruitment not being followed by immediate action? What can be done to stir stakeholders to action on behalf of children in conflict arenas? In other words, why can we and how can we overcome some of the practical and political challenges causing delayed action, including the bureaucracy of decision making, the bureaucracy of action in governments and in intergovernmental organizations such as the African Union, the UN, and other regional bodies. Also, what can we do in situations where early warning signals have already been sounded, yet action has not followed? I may take the example of my country, Cameroon. Over the past 4 years, hundreds of thousands of children are not able to go to school. And schools have become what I call the center of gravity. And yet, no action has followed. So helping to come up with an early warning system, it's one thing, but how without that system triggering action doesn't help. So as we discuss about early warning and early action, we should be able to look at what are those practical and political challenges that are leading to delayed action in spite of early warning is something very important to note. There is also the question of what I call the accountability for action, accountability for protection. We've seen a lot of situations where recruiters have been recruiting for decades, yet very little is being done currently to hold them accountable. In my view, this is very important. If they are held accountable, that can act as can dissuade other recruiters. Now, have them like in Somalia and in Central Africa, where for decades you have child soldier recruiters that have been going on for long, and nothing or very little has been done. Doesn't really help in also. So looking at how to hold them accountable is very important. There is also another question, which I think it's you could call it a provocative question, is should child soldiers be considered and treated only as victims? Is there room for some form of accountability when it comes to children who have participated in atrocities? Do we take any agency from the children in terms of their capacity to, to commit crimes and to be held accountable when they do commit crimes in situations of armed conflict? Because you may think that giving them this kind of blanket amnesty perhaps is encouraging some children to join armed groups. This, in my view, is an area we'll talk about research, where research could really be of help. Seeing, is there any link between this, what I call the general amnesty, and the notion that children should only be seen in the context of armed conflict as victims? Can they also be seen as aggressors on a case-by-case basis? And based on these questions, I have a few suggestions to make, and one of which I think Shelly did mention in her introductory remarks, that it's important to see what lessons can be learned from existing early warning for conflict prevention, for example. What lessons can we learn from those systems? And a suggestion I'm going to make is that data, especially statistics, is very important in developing, in operationalization and the smooth functioning of an early warning for the prevention of child soldier recruitment. And in this regard, it's important to be able to develop scenarios. For example, some scenarios could be built on what could potentially happen when a conflict is breaking out, in terms of what are the number of children who will be affected, how would that impact on schools, and how many of them may end up being recruited, And so for policy makers and for decision makers as well, presenting them with this raw data in terms of what could eventually happen based on scenario 1 or scenario 2 can help also engineer action on their part. Another key area I thought also is where I think research could focus on is the connection between what we are increasingly seeing in terrorism context, where communities are coming together and forming vigilante group or self-defense groups, and eventually some of the children who join these vigilante groups may end up becoming child soldiers, because some of them do transition to become armed groups. So it's important to see the nexus between vigilante groups and child soldiering. Also, as a way forward, empowering communities and empowering community agency to fight child soldiering is very important. As you did state in your introductory remarks, I've been in Somalia working there over the past 5 years. And I've seen situations where communities have said enough is enough. They haven't received support from perhaps their government, but they have been able to come together and using their own devices to say enough is not Al-Shabaab, and then they take the war to Al-Shabaab too. And many of them have succeeded, to prevent their children from being recruited. How can these communities be supported? And this is also a very important aspect. And broadly, the issue I talked about, accountability. It's important to see research should be able to help us understand if the blanket amnesty we give to children who participate in armed conflict, if that is not an incentive, for other children to join in the groups, especially when we know that following post-war situation, many of them they are rehabilitated. Many of them end up being given skills that help them to become successful people tomorrow in communities where those who didn't join the war don't have the same opportunities. And lastly, prevention of child soldier recruitment and youth through early warning requires monitoring and reporting on all the other 6 violations, especially attack on schools. As an early indicator, if there is a conflict going on somewhere, like in Cameroon right now in the English-speaking section, schools are not going on, clearly that is an early warning. And so action should follow. And there must be ways of finding out how to, figuring out how to pressure, using political pressure, using diplomatic pressure on decision makers, on governments and intergovernmental bodies to take immediate action to prevent increasingly more children being joining the armed separatist groups. This is what I can say for now. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Walters, for your remarks and for the questions that you've posed for further reflection. Certainly important given the timeliness of situations that you referenced, such as your home country of Cameroon. I'd like to now take the opportunity to introduce our next speaker, Lieutenant Colonel Lausanne Ingabire. Lausanne joined the Rwanda Defense Force in 2004 and was commissioned in 2009 as an infantry officer after completing her cadet course at the Royal Military Academy in Belgium. Lausanne was posted to the Rwanda Military Academy GACO from 2009 to 2011, where she served as Deputy S9. From 2011 to 2014, she was a Civic and Gender Staff Officer at the Rwanda Defense Force Command and Staff College, and she also participated in the African Union Peacekeeping Mission in Central African Republic and the United Nations Peacekeeping Operation in Central African Republic in 2014 as Civic and Gender Officer. From 2015 to 2017, she was a Gender Focal Point and Civic Staff Officer at the J9 Department at the RDF headquarters. Currently, she is the Military Gender Advisor in the Office of Military Affairs in the United Nations Department for Peace Operations and headquartered in New York. Lausanne is also someone who has been a participant in the Dallaire Institute training over our period of operations in Rwanda. We're so happy to have her with us today, and we welcome all of the wealth of the experience that she would bring to us today. So Lausanne, welcome.
Thank you, Shelly. I would like to thank the Dallaire Institute for the opportunity to share with you and the audience what the Office of the Military Affairs in the United Nations Department of Peace Operations is doing for improving detection and response to early warning indicators in conflict setting. Research and examples have highlighted the important roles that marginalized gender groups can play in early warning system. Those groups are more likely to prioritize risk reduction and also to learn and participate to early warning mechanisms. However, changes in the past years in the conduct of warfare have significant implications for the link between warning and response. Also to notice that good practice indicates that the best way of linking warning and response is to foster an exchange between warner, the communities, the population, and responder in our situation, the military component in the field. Such an exchange is not one where response options are discussed, the what, but rather where strategy for response is discussed, the why. It also flags the importance of timely responses. If the military component is not set up to enable quick response to warning, then positive impact is likely to be reduced and negative consequence will increase. Also, a key function of early warning system is to monitor the impact of responses to violent conflict and inform changes in strategy and policies and way of responding to human rights violation. It means that the strengths of the warning response link depend on how well the value added by early warning is understood by the military component, the relationship and quality of the exchange community military component. The 2018 Cruise report and the Amusu report on the Central African Republic noted a gap in the United Nations military component information collection from the local population. According to these reports, this gap was due to an absence of human intelligence, situational awareness, or the ability to engage with local population and community in the area of responsibility. If the military component is to be operationally effective, we should have the ability to recognize significant changes, risk, threats, and assess the impact into communities. Anticipating conflicts or humanitarian crisis that could have an immediate or potential impact on the population and the mission is the essence of the entire peace process. As a timely response to this gap, to the Amusu and Cruise report, the Office of the Military Affairs mission and member state here in New York gathered the prime attention to a new capability called the engagement platoon. Why focus on engagement? Community engagement has the potential to go past merely making information available or gathering opinion and sometimes attitude. It entails a more dynamic exchange of information and viewpoints between field mission, the military component, and the population at risk. In terms of early warning system and response agenda, the Office of the Military Affairs approach is to use more and more engagement platoon capability within the boots on the ground, the infantry unit in field mission at the tactical level to ensure a placement close to response decision making and to enhance effectiveness and relevance of boot on the ground, as I mentioned. To meet the need, some TCCs and some missions such as MONUSCO have organized female engagement team around 2017 and ad hoc female engagement team around 2017 and 2018. at the unit level, with the intent to provide unit commanders a dedicated capability to engage the local population. The different threats and concerns that impact men and women as a result of any conflict must be taken into account and duly analyzed, and in doing so, recognize the importance of having both men and women peacekeepers as part of daily patrol section. As the concept was analyzed 2017, 2018, it evolved into a mixed gender engagement platoon consisting of at least 50% of women. To integrate gender into early warning mechanism, both men and women must have the opportunity to report freely and confidently with confidence on their security situation. Also, protection of civilian analysis should also consider how issues of gender and diversity interact with risk and vulnerability, and think about the role different groups play in early warning and prevention. The engagement platoon framework was included into the 2020 revised United Nations Infantry Battalion Manual, approved in January this year. It's recognized this critical task by noting the battalion, the boots on the ground, the tactical level must factor engagement into its planning. Engagement platoons are tasked to enhance opportunities for interaction and engagement with local community, increase the field mission operational effectiveness, and support improvement of the military component situational awareness, as I mentioned earlier. Also, I just want to use that opportunity to also thank Canada for co-chairing with Uruguay the engagement platoon training package that we are developing, as well as the handbook that we are developing, and also for providing a subject matter expert in this development. Early warning indicators can and provide significant base from which the environment can be better predicted. Early warning indicators defined by the unit and the mission set the context for a systematic gathering and analysis of information. These indicators can prevent potential risk and threat, and also new opportunities to the unit or the community to improve its response to threat and risk and changes. It will also improve the reaction time between warning and response. Mapping the population and its environment and establishing early warning indicators in conflict context don't require intelligence professionals to establish the indicators tracked by the military component in the field. The ability to anticipate potential environmental change or conflict is key to a good engagement, again, task and vice versa. The time duration between becoming aware of potential threat and the event itself is critical and will require a prompt and appropriate response. It indicates also how reactive and well prepared is the unit's response. During the pre-deployment training engagement platoon, our sensor in this case will be trained to timely detect those warning indicators, report, and then advise or recommend a suitable response to those indicators. But then now, how the engagement platoon will build indicators. In this context, indicators used are the specific measurable variables and observation that unit uses to monitor and verify the extent of change, risk, and threats. Using the engagement platoon at the tactical level to detect those changes mentioned from community to community makes it more likely that decision-making process will consider those indicators. A real response will be taken that fulfill the mission mandate to protect civil population. Commanders as well have to be aware of all possible sources of information. Could be youth community, could be women organization, could be just daily people that patrol section meets during their activity, and focus on how to bridge the gap between the UN and community and implement the mandate. Bottom line, is that the warning response link remain fundamental and essential. Also, the good news is that early warning mechanism continue to add value to mission. It does so in ways that range from informing decision-making, as I mentioned, predicting and drawing conflict trends, providing input to response and strategy formulation, alerting as well community of risk and saving lives, and initiating violent conflict response. I would like to stop here, and then I hope during the Q&A version, I'll have the opportunity to talk in deep about the engagement platoon capability.
Thank you so much, Lausanne. Really incredibly important points that you've raised about how we put this into action. And I will definitely use the opportunity during the Q&A to probe you a bit more on the engagement platoons. Thank you for your leadership also on issues related to gender and for joining us here today. I am now very pleased to introduce our next speaker, Achaleke Christian Leke, who is the National Coordinator of Local Youth Corner Cameroon, which is a youth-led peacebuilding civil society organization. Achaleke is a peacebuilding and countering violent extremist expert with 14 years of experience working as a practitioner and a researcher in conflict prevention, peacebuilding, counterterrorism, and preventing violent extremism in Cameroon and other conflict-affected countries around the world. He has executed over 500 projects that have impacted over 1 million young people across the world. His work as a peace builder is inspired by his childhood of growing up in conflict and lived violence on hand. His experience of violence has shaped his approach in designing, implementing community-based projects and global policy. As a practitioner and an academic, Christian has engaged in expert consultations, developing and designing many development and peace-related publications and policy recommendations, including with UN Security Council resolutions, and he has also published in 4 youth-led evidence-based peace-building development-oriented publications in Cameroon. Among his several recognitions, in 2020, he was awarded the Premio Mundo Negro a la Fraternidad Black World Award in Spain, and in 2019 was recognized as a chevening changemaker in the world. In 2018, he was awarded the Luxembourg Peace Prize Outstanding Youth Peacemaker. And in 2017 and 2016, he featured among 100 of the most influential young Africans. In 2016, he was named the most influential young Cameroonian. In that same year, he was also recognized by the Commonwealth as the Commonwealth Young Person of the Year and winner of the Commonwealth Youth Award of Excellence in Development Work, where he was received by Queen Elizabeth of England. Achaleke, we're really, really grateful that you are here with us today, and based off some of the incredible remarks we've had this week, I'm so looking forward to your participation and what we can all be doing to put early warning into early action. So Achaleke, the floor is now yours.
Thank you very, very much. And I feel very honored to join this conversation. And it's very inspiring to hear from, senior practitioners as a young person. I just turned 30 this year. And I feel very inspired listening from, senior practitioners, and they are sharing some of the things which really reflect in the context of Cameroon and other countries across the African continent and other parts of the world. And, my perspective is more around the role of young people, and early warning and early response is very, very important, I must say, because I've had the opportunity to work on the field on crisis zones, and also growing up in a community. I'm very happy to have my elder brother from Cameroon on this conversation. I grew up in Fiango Kumba, and you should know, and it's a community which had a lot of similarities with what we are facing today in the country, where we had issues of gang violence, and we could see radicalization at a very timid level. But I mean, the drivers were still very the same. We could see young people, at the age of 13, I could fight on the street already. So I was a child and I understood what this meant. And I could see many other children who were involved in this. Now, in a context where, violence has really transformed and conflicts have transformed to what we have today. We have, terrorism, we have violent extremism, things are really changing. Social media is now very popular and things are working very differently. And what we are seeing is that early warning and response is becoming even much more critical. But now the challenge we face sometimes is the problem of the response and even the design of the early warning. I had the opportunity to be invited by UNESCO regional office in Cameroon, which is covering 10 countries, to lead, early warning for the Northwest and the Southwest region. Now, I received a concept note already, which is different. That means that, young people who are at the center of this conflict, be it as perpetrators, be it as victims, and be it as solution providers. And I'd like to highlight that, in this process, the amount of young people who are perpetrators is very small. It's not up to 1%. Now, those who are victims, we have a huge number. And those who, despite, the challenges, despite the push factors of radicalization and all of that, they are not turning into, carrying arms or fighting. Now, young people are not involved in the process of designing these processes. Sometimes we are only brought to implement. And, last week I was speaking to some colleagues in the far north region of Cameroon where we have Boko Haram insurgency. And we are speaking to people on the field. And, young people, be it children and youth, are expressing the challenge that, the cities organizations coming to work, they have no idea. Response becomes very difficult because there's no community ownership. There's not that sense of belonging in the solution provision of it. It makes it very, very complex for us to have response. Now, from an organizational level, when we saw such challenges, now what we took as young people and wanting to push is how do we respond even when there's no financing? How do we respond even when we're not involved in the design of the early warnings that we might read? And how do we collaborate? How do we form social grouping to respond? And that is what has made us to be able to see the kind of impact that we have in our work. I take, for example, in the far north region of Cameroon, there's this issue of a Amajiri system of education. It's in the northeast of Nigeria, it's in the far north of Cameroon, where children who are abandoned, children who have nowhere to go to, where parents take their children to a Quranic teacher. I mean, these are children between 2 to 15. And where with this Quranic teacher, what they are taught is only Quranic education. In the morning, they go out to beg. And what we have seen is that sometimes they do not return because they are either recruited along begging from their home to the market. And even where they stay, it's so frustrating when you see where they are. And of course, proposition for recruitment is going to be very obvious because they are giving you a better option, And in most of these places, resource acquisition is a big problem. People are very broke and they have major challenges, issues around education. And not just formal education, but moral and ethical education are missing. And in the far north, this was what we faced. I went on the field and my colleagues actually cried because we saw this situation, an active space where Boko Haram recruits, these children go, young girls, young girls, they carry this vest and they explode in the market. The process of radicalization is very eminent. I have worked on the field and this is what we see. But on our part as young people, we could not wait for maybe UNICEF or whatsoever to take action because it is my country. If I let it happen, my country is getting robbed. I will not wait for resources to come and all of that. We decided to launch an initiative called the Salam Initiative. Salam means peace because there's also issue around messaging, counter narrative and all of that, which we work extensively around. So the Salam Initiative, which focus on providing non-formal and formal education to children who find themselves in Amajiri. As we speak, we have 120 children. When we started the initiative, there was no funding, there was no resources. But we have to do, because the biggest challenge on funds when it comes to early warning is lack of resources to do it. And the issue of blame game and waiting for someone else to act and for you to take action. We took action. When we started, there was no classroom, there was nothing. It was just an open sandy space, and we were doing this under the sun. And for local ownership, we worked with young girls from this locality and young boys to come in as volunteer teachers, to come in as volunteer people to accompany them for re-education. And we started, it was like a joke, but we took it very serious. The day we informed administrative authorities that we need to respond because Boko Haram recruits children based on issues around literacy, poverty, etc. We need to respond. And the divisional officer was like, people tried it, and we said, we can do it. And today, as we speak, this place is running. They even have uniforms now. And these uniforms were even produced by prisonpreneurs. We have a project called Prisonpreneurship, where we're building entrepreneurs in prison. And they were produced from prisons from within this region. And some of these inmates in this prison have been associated with Boko Haram, where we are trying to rehabilitate them. So we try to make this connection. And today, the first 2 months of our response, when we spoke to these kids, asking them, who do they want to become? They all wanted to become soldiers. Why? Because these are children who have seen their parents being killed. And they are filled with anger. And they only wanted to become soldiers in order to pay back. But today, as we speak, this is our second year. We are about to resume. We don't know what we're going to do, but we are doing it already. And today, they want to become doctors. They want to become teachers. They are dancing. They have bicycles and all of that. Now, it was a crazy idea. We didn't think of setting up the best curriculum before we started, because these children are being recruited every day. So the issue of response, we are facing the challenge of who should act first. And when government make policy, when international organization does research and give us this early warning, communities sometimes do not want to act because they were not part of the process. And the issue of who should start first. But as young people, we are changing the narrative because we are the ones suffering the most. And today we are seeing the kind of success that we are having because we decided to take action, and an action which is based on evidence from the early warning. So my first clarion call is that, young people and stakeholders, following this conversation should understand that sometimes to take action does not require a lot of resources. You start the idea and it grows up. Today, the community has helped us to build a hut in grass, still under a very hot sun, but it's working. And recently, they've offered us a piece of land to construct. We don't have any resources to construct, but just the fact that a piece of land has been provided for construction shows that there's local ownership, that the community, traditional rulers and all of that have seen the importance of responding on an issue which is very critical, which is lack of access to quality education, which is responding to moral and ethical values and re-educating children where schools have been destroyed and all of that. It is the same thing which we are reflecting on the Anglophone region, where, they have talked about, mediation, dialogue and all of that. But these are all lip service. It's on Twitter, it's on Instagram, it's on that and that. And nothing is happening on the field and people are dying. I am born from this region. I have lost family, I've lost close friends. I cannot go back even there because my life has been threatened. But what do we do to respond? Do we sit and wait? We have policies and all of that, yes. But alternatively, we have been able to set up the first youth mediators network in the country, made up of young people between 15 to 35 years old who are serving as frontliners in mediation, in dialogue, in negotiation, intercultural conversations. And these are very important. I mean, these are practical examples of what we've been able to do. But before I close, I would like to reiterate the challenges. Why? Because there has been the question, why is response slow? Response is slow because there's limited financing. There's a lot of investment in the early warning, but little investment in the response. Another thing is in the design of early warning processes. Young people, women are not really included in this process, whereas they are the ones who suffer the most, and they are the ones who are working hard to be able to provide solutions. Important inclusivity is done. Another thing which we see is the issue of collaboration in this process. We know that not every institution that is able to design an early warning mechanism should be the same to respond, and all of that published becomes much more useful. Sometimes that they don't work in direct line with government. For example, But at the same time, when the government is trying to mount pressure on them, when there are other stakeholders to respond on the field, it works. And that's what we've been able to see. In 2017, I was in Switzerland on a security meeting. And when we were talking about the Anglophone crisis, it was new then. And we talked about the fact that, I mentioned the fact that we are going to have armed groups who are going to use children. I was even laughed at by even a government official who was part of that meeting. It's not possible. Cameroonians are very peaceful. We said, no. We've seen early warning reports. We've seen data. We've been on the field. They are being inspired by what is happening in Nigeria, by the Biafra war. They are being inspired by how Boko Haram is succeeding in some parts. It means we need to be able to respond to the key core issues that it was never taken into consideration. As we speak today in my work around tracking, armed groups and all of that, we have over 50 of them existing. And children are the ones they are recruiting every day. We do not have school now, and people are talking about back to school, but they are not reflecting around how do you design education that responds to a child's psychosocial need. A child who is born in conflict, you cannot imagine how destroyed that child is. The child has grown up to listen to only guns, bombs, and running. To an extent where I had this experience of a child where, just something sparked, and this child was afraid and wanted to run to go under the bed. This is the kind of trauma we have. So in response to education, as my senior brother said, we have to take into consideration designing curriculum to respond to mental health related issues of these children, psychosocial support, and preparing them to be able to have education in a way where it will be transformative. So, these were just some of the thoughts that I had. And speaking from more evidence-based, what is happening on the field, I feel that what my co-speakers have mentioned is very strong, and hope cannot be lost. What the Institute is doing, I think that more effort needs to be put, and other stakeholders need to support work on the ground, especially young people, because across Africa, young people make up over 75% of the population. It means that if we want peace, there's going to be peace. It means that if we want war, there's going to be war. So the fact that the continent is not torn, it means that young people want peace. The young boys and girls are very interested in building peace. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you so much, Achaleke. I cannot echo more clearly the need to listen to young people such as yourself. I completely understand why you have received all of the accolades and the awards that you've received for being a young leader, but your messages are so incredibly important for us to heed and to understand in terms of action. I really, really am grateful to have you here today, and I hope that when we finish today that we can start to talk about how do we put things into action. I would also like to thank all of you that have been here thus far with us, joining us as participants, to all of our speakers for the wonderful discussion so far. At this point, I would like us to move into our discussion portion of the panel, where we hope to continue this fruitful conversation. I do have a list of questions to draw from, and would like to thank those who submitted discussion questions in advance. I'd like to also encourage all of our panelists to feel free to ask one another questions as well. We want this to be driven by all of you that are here and have such amazing thoughts that we could certainly continue long after this symposium is finished. So I'll begin, first of all, to pose some questions to the panelists. And I'll begin with posing the first question to Lausanne. So Lausanne, I'm curious to hear your response about one of the questions that we have here, which talks about the fact that there is a current challenge in the early warning field, is that there is this difficulty of an effective translation of early alerts on impending crisis into early collaborative and preventative action. And if we hear what Achaleke was talking about, and certainly yourself, you come from a country that also had experienced the failure of the international community to act early, how can an early warning system be built to compel early action? And at what point should early warning trigger early action? When is early enough?
Thank you, Shelly, again for this question. This is very much pertinent. I'm going to talk about from a military perspective. I'm from the infantry. The challenges that in the military company is facing in responding to early warning is, as Achaleke said, is the language. People who develop those indicators, people who develop all those early warning mechanisms, sometimes to translate it in a military language, in more easy to understand language for boots on the ground, again, those infantry guys who meet with people, sometimes those, it's not clear for them to understand. So that's why we expect with that new capability, the engagement platoon, to translate indicator that already there for child protection and conflict-related sexual violence and other indicators, to translate in some sort of language that soldier in the ground will easily understand, and then advise, report for the right action to do due to this indicator, due to those issues and changes in the field. Yeah.
Thank you, Lausanne. Yes, certainly as part of the Dallaire Institute's work, we have often talked about the lexicon that has to be used based on who it is, the audience that you are speaking with. And I think that understanding the military language is very important. It's also important for us to find a way to create that translation. And then we don't mean in different languages, we mean across sectors and that collaboration. So it made me think a lot too about Achaleke's perspective. Youth also use a different dialogue and a different approach to speaking. And certainly we should think about that too when we're thinking of early warning, what to them would be something really incredibly important to create that dialogue, and ways that maybe there are ways that youth groups such as the ones that he has referenced in Cameroon can find a way to more effectively get that language and approach across. Mm-hmm. So thank you for that. I think that that's a really important point to bring out. I would like to go to my next question, and certainly I want to pose this one to Dr. Walters. There are presently a large array of early warning systems that analyze and predict various elements of conflict development. You yourself have been involved in some of those very areas, and the emission analysis cell that you are a part of is certainly taking in that info. But what we do not really understand well is that many of these systems don't explicitly consider the recruitment and use of children from an early stage, or lack of child protection, as an indicator that should flag action. So how can these early warning systems better incorporate child-centered indicators and make the link to action? What, from your perspective, should be done to make that clear?
Yeah, I think this is, you really identified a gap that exists in the existing early warning mechanisms for conflict prevention. And it becomes very important to get to have trained experts who are embedded within these mechanisms, whose main job will be to really monitor the situation of children in a conflict situation, identifying those indicators and mainstreaming them in the reports, without which those monitoring the situation on the ground often focus on other, most like casualties and other elements, and often oblivious of elements such as child soldier recruitment, attack on schools, and it's how it's linked to eventually a situation where children are being recruited. Now, in that area, training is increasingly very important. in situations where you can not deploy an expert, a child protection expert within those mechanisms, there are possibilities of training them and to become aware of those indicators, and so that such that they can now incorporate them into their reports. But as we all know, oftentimes, even when they do so, action is not taken. And so the element which you and Lausanne were discussing a while ago, it's really important that early warning indicators, when they are sounded, they should trigger governmental action. But given the bureaucracy of decision making in government, which is not going to go away any soon, it's very important to have a multi-track intervention approach where you engaging with the government while at the same time supporting what Achaleke is doing, for example, for the case of Cameroon, community initiative. I'm talking about track 2 and track 3 communities that are pre-existing mechanisms that are already working to, to protect children or to fight against child soldier recruitment. So back to your question, it is increasingly important to have people within those early warning mechanisms that are aware of the importance, and they are trained to have the skills to be able to detect elements or issues that would lead to child soldier recruitment. Otherwise, deploy experts to work with them and then eventually help them to get that capacity.
Yes, thank you very much, Dr. Walters. I think that the point of the training, the awareness, one of the elements that we often talk about, and people who've been watching throughout this week will hear me say, is that we need to put the lens on from the perspective of children, and we have to see the world from that perspective. And a lot of times, many who are involved in the analysis of conflict prevention don't have that particular lens. And this is where I find the connection to youth groups exceptionally interesting for us to explore. The next question that I would like to pose, though, is to Siobhan. So Siobhan, you've done an awful lot of work on matters related to recruitment and use of children in various contexts, and especially non-state armed actors. And although the terms recruitment and use are typically viewed as one activity by many, they're talked about as one activity, including in international law, they are in fact two discrete activities and from an early warning perspective. And so if recruitment is defined in the broadest sense to include all of the ways children are associated with that from an early stage, it is a necessary precursor to determine use of children. So how should these two different activities be structured when we're thinking of early warning to enable effective prevention?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think one of the challenges here is it's not sort of a binary distinction. It's a whole spectrum of engagement. And that makes it really hard. So at sort of what point of the spectrum do you ramp up resources and warning signals? And I think we're moving away, obviously, and rightfully, from this idea of sort of card-carrying members, right? Who are all recruited very formally in a formal recruitment process, and particularly for children. I mean, children have all types of engagement that varies in intensity and duration and the type of roles that they play or don't play, if they're paid, not paid, if it's very much a transactional opportunity, sort of a spectrum of coercion through which they become involved. So I think it's really hard there, if we look at the evidence about involvement, to make this sort of distinction, because it all kind of bleeds together. And sort of where do you draw the line? There's obviously very clear examples of organized recruitment that are much easier to sort of respond to in that space. But this, again, this spectrum of involvement, I think, is really important. And part of it, I think, comes up in what's been brought up in the last questions that you posed and what the last speaker said, is that part of it is understanding very much from a local level and from those personally impacted what involvement means, right? And so that's that local knowledge, but it's also, and as you just highlighted, Shelly, making sure local experiences and voices and participatory approaches include those who are impacted. I'm just reminded, and I mentioned this when we talked last week, I think is really, really interesting. There's been some work around gang violence and trying to understand in the US when you're going to anticipate upticks in gang violence in Chicago. And they were using Twitter and other types of analytics to understand how language changes and what that might mean for outbreaks of violence. And one of the most important parts about this work was they realized that a bunch of PhDs in elite universities were completely ill-prepared for designing models in that space. And it was actually young people who had been involved in gang violence who were able to tell you about the types of language and modeling and sort of where you would hit that tipping point. So I think for this array of activity, when we decide sort of where the point is along the spectrum where you would want to have early warning, where you would want to have potential engagement, I think young people who have been affected, who have been recruited, who have been involved are going to be key for us deciding sort of where that point is for us on the spectrum between recruitment and use, and better helping us differentiate sort of along the way, sort of where those different points are and where the potential leverage points are, I think, for intervention.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Siobhan. That really is brings me to wanting to pose back to Achaleke about this very response from Siobhan, and to talk about the fact that most early warning efforts are focused on generating actions at the level of government and intergovernmental organizations that are typically slow to act, bureaucratic in many ways, and often are grounded in self-interest and economic interest. So Achaleke, I'm wondering, in terms of your profound experience in what you are doing now and what you are seeing on the ground, in terms of the recruitment of children at the community level, what would you, if you could look back at this, you talked about 2017 being in Sweden and talking to people about making them aware of the fact that this was occurring and people not believing you. I mean, I can talk to you that was similar in Syria. People didn't believe that children were going to be recruited and used in that context. And that spectrum that Siobhan references is so important, because I think that everybody always goes to that final imagery that they have of the kid who is in the uniform and already has the gun or is already, blowing up areas. So if you think of that dynamic, and you think of, the young people you collaborate with now in that spectrum, what could we have done, or what should we be doing in terms of supporting those particular groups that you reference? Money, of course, is always a major factor when it comes to action. But I'm just wondering, from your wonderful perspective, what could we be doing to make this get into action quicker?
Well, I think that in as much as the response from government and internationals are very important, but you already mentioned that bureaucracy prevents us to get the work on the ground, because the real impact is on the field. And sometimes governments and even internationals do not have access to these communities. I will tell you, as a researcher, I've seen situations where people come and stay maybe in Abuja and are reflecting on something happening in Maiduguri. Maiduguri, Abuja is a couple of hours.
That's different.
So when you are on the field, what you see is that the people want local involvement and ownership. And this is something which is usually missing. I will tell you, if we look at when we do what we call pass it on, if we train young people, for example, who come from 10 regions, and we do what we call pass it on, and we give them small seed grants. A grant of $100 can change 10 and couple of people. But sometimes we are looking at just the big grants to say, okay, because we cannot give 200,000 a minimum, okay, we cannot do the work. But trust me, young people are willing and able to do the work on the field. So I'm recommending that what is missing, or what should be done, is engaging young boys and girls on the ground who are already doing work. There are hundreds of organizations in Cameroon. If you look at the report, from the UN, the missing piece, which talked about financing youth peace building organization. A handful, over 60% are operating under $10,000 budget. Now, we spend $200,000 to design an early warning, and we cannot invest $5,000 for work on the field. I give an example of the school that we are running. We have not had a dime of support, but the community is supporting the process because they felt that it is their problem and they want to solve the problem. And that takes us to resilience building, which is key around building peace and preventing violent extremism. Resilience for communities to feel that this problem which they are facing is not a Western problem. It's a problem in their community. Their children are the ones suffering. Parents and mothers, religious, traditional authorities need to feel included. And this is something that needs to be done. And as I said, if an early warning mechanism is designed with young people, it's designed with community, not for them to implement, for them to design, because there are some aspects that we'll be bringing on the table, which they will not see, because we are the ones suffering the most. There are friends who have been recruited. I speak to a couple of them. And why are they recruited? On very, very little things, which sometimes we feel government is the only one to respond to it. No. But whereas an entrepreneur who is providing employment could respond to it. And that's why we always propose the interdisciplinary approach in response, where we look at people working on gender-based violence, people working on entrepreneurship development, people working on different components which are push and pull factors of recruitment and conflict to be part of this process. IT guys, because today, tech entrepreneurs feel that they cannot talk about peace and security. But we have seen how people have developed apps and all of that to be able to respond to them. Why don't we engage them? Musicians, the same thing. Movie, theater, edutainment, we don't look at these things. Let's do an inclusive development of response of the early warning mechanism. Trust me, when people feel included, they will respond. Just take it to your family. When you tell your dad your problem at the early stage, he'll be able to respond even when it gets worse. But if you just go ahead and you don't tell anyone, and now everyone wants to respond, and we see that you've spent hundreds of thousands of US dollars to design, early warning, and you cannot invest when it comes to respond. You cannot trust young people who are on the field, young boys and girls, even children. We have children these days who are super smart. At the age of 9, they can mobilize many young people. In our continent, we see that happening, but investment is not done in these spaces. So investment is important. Adopting interdisciplinary approach in designing and implementing is important for us to be able to have accurate response on the field. And with our examples, which I've mentioned, you can check the statistics and see we have 120 children, taking care of them. We have to feed them. Where are the resources coming from? To an extent where you take your per diem. I started that project. When I go to the US, I buy from the Dollar Tree, where things are sold for $1. I buy books, I buy pens, and I carry in my luggage and bring back home to start this process. And this is what we've been able to do. We have shown the way. We don't want to ask for support when we have not done work. We've done the work. It is getting heavy on our shoulders. Investment needs to be done in young people. And there are several young people. I worked in Rwanda. I work in many countries across Africa. I have young people. I work within the Commonwealth as a consultant, coordinating 53 countries. So what I'm telling you are the concerns of young people from Jamaica to Trinidad and Tobago, to India, to Bangladesh, to Cameroon, to Nigeria, and across the world who are expressing these challenges. And research has shown us, unfortunately, we do these research publications, it highlights these challenges, and yet it takes time for us to have results. So I'm using this to advocate on behalf of my peers who might not be watching now, who will watch the recording later, that we are saying that young people are not longer agents of violence, as it has been said. We are ambassadors of peace and change. Include us, give us opportunity, give us resources, and we'll be able to support in solving problems. I mean, these are my thoughts around that.
Thank you. I feel like those are so important points for us to get across. And I was laughing when you mentioned about Abuja, Maiduguri. This time last year, I was on my way to Maiduguri, and I recollected about how few others were there from outside the world to outside of Nigeria, from other parts of the world that were not there. And certainly the perspectives of listening to some of the young people who had joined, some of the civilian joint task force and others, and their perspectives on those challenges was so important. But I think that probably the most important thing is that they wanted to be listened to and heard, and then they wanted to be part of the solution. So there's, there is, this perspective sometimes that we are viewing children and youth as the problem as opposed to the solution. Adults overcomplicate things. You mentioned grants like $100 US. Well, what do we have? We have situations where we have organizations and governments too, who are making us have to put in such overbearing measures to make sure that the money is not being spent in incorrect ways, that it gets to the point where inaction happens as a result because people are too afraid of making a mistake. But if we are afraid of making mistakes, we are never going to be able to find new and innovative solutions, right? So that's my soapbox to help you, okay? Because I also agree with what you're saying. I wanted to turn my next question though to Lausanne, because Lausanne, you wanted to talk a bit more about the mixed engagement teams and the platoons, and I wanted to just build off a little bit on this point. Is there something we could be doing with the mixed engagement platoons or engagement platoons generally that we could be doing to really help make sure that that connection of preventing recruitment and use of children is seen as a central aspect of how they need to see the conflicts that they're in and the communities that they deal with? Is there, just wondering from your perspective and knowledge and listening to all of these perspectives, what can we do to change that?
I think what institute and researcher can do is engagement first, better translation, as I mentioned before, and the panelists also mentioned about it, but also propose what will be the best responses in situation X, Y, Z, in indicators X, Y, Z. What will be the recommended best course of action to do? And then from the military side, we can translate it in real task and action that those engagement teams can be doing in the field. But for me, those indicators and everything can be collected only if there is better engagement with community. If there is no engagement with community, it's difficult to get to understand those indicators and how best to respond to it.
Mm-hmm, yeah. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. No, thank you very much for that, Lausanne. I have one last question that I'm going to pose to each of you to respond. So if everybody wants to take a moment to give some final reflections, is that certainly a key panel issue, really, that a theme has been recurring across the panels this week is the new normal and the COVID-19 pandemic, and what are some of the influences that this has had in terms of recruitment and use of children in conflict zones. So I wanted you to just quickly reflect on whether or not you can think of some new ways that we can address this issue given the current situation we're in with this pandemic. And I'll let Dr. Walters, I'll let you respond first, okay?
Kindly, Shelly, can you just take over the question? I didn't get it very well.
Oh, sure. I was just posing the question of, in terms of the COVID-19 pandemic and the new normal, if you could think about some of the ways that this is, we need to be thinking about this in terms of new ways to minimize recruitment and use of children in conflict zones.
Okay. Clearly, the COVID pandemic has affected all walks of life, and it's had very devastating effect on fragile societies, areas where conflict is going on. It's really made the situation worse. Already children in conflict situations are vulnerable. And you can imagine that with the COVID pandemic, it makes their situation even worse, especially many of them who are in IDP camps, whether it's in Central Africa or it's in Somalia. IDP camps, which is one of the target areas of child soldier recruitment. Now, because of the COVID pandemic, humanitarian actors they're finding it very difficult to assess such communities and leaving many of them to go without, basic fundamental necessities. So one of the ways we could do to really help goes back to what I think all of us up here have said, the importance of building and working with pre-existing mechanisms, working with local actors, be they traditional elders, if it's the case of Somalia, traditional chiefs in the case of Central Africa or elsewhere in Congo, working with women's association, working with youth groups like those Achaleke is working with, such that in times where, and this is one thing we should be learning, I heard you, Shelly, saying COVID, it's certainly a disaster, but here it also presents opportunities. Mm-hmm. We should find other ways of working. We should find ways of, adaptation to be able to continue to deliver a mandate. There's no justification for aid organization, for institutes like the Leke Initiative to say, because of COVID, we can't do anything. Just looking at other ways of working, and it emphasizes the importance of local ownership, working with local communities who are there. They don't need access anymore. So if anything, in response to your question, is increasingly work with local actors, work with pre-existing mechanisms to address issues regarding child soldier recruitment.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Siobhan, would you like to respond?
I'd love to, and I'm super excited because I feel like I'm a kid who studied for the right test.
Yeah.
Because my colleague Kato Van Berkoven, who's on the call as well, we've written an op-ed exactly on this issue that we're trying to have placed right now. So I'm really excited to talk about it. I think one thing to recognize is that all types of armed actors and non-state groups have tried to instrumentalize COVID. The mafia, gangs in Central and South America, all kinds of armed groups. So sometimes this is a way to critique the government. The Taliban has been going around and doing hand sanitizer distribution and taking people's temperatures. You have white supremacists in the United States that are trying to weaponize it, where they tell their followers who have it to go out and cough on Jews or on police officers. So we have that happening. And then we have groups like Boko Haram who are using it to critique the West, to announce that they are immune and so are their followers, and to use it as a way to potentially recruit. Mm-hmm. I think this is a really important moment. In conflict, there are always generational divides. COVID, even in non-conflict societies, has definitely highlighted those generational divides. I'm sure many people on this call have older parents that they're really frustrated with. Many young people feel like they bear the brunt of this pandemic, and older people who hold all the power, who have maintained their jobs, who have all the opportunities and sort of pulled the ladder up behind them, we're staying at home to protect them. So there's this frustration all over the world, and it's manifesting itself in different ways. From our research, when we looked at young people and why they were attracted to armed groups, and I think it's not just this negative pull, this no other options, but sometimes armed groups very much can present an attractive other option. And there's a question for us, I think, before us today, which is, in COVID, are they especially attractive? Because if there is no economic opportunity, if you're young in society and you're the first hired and most likely the first fired, so you're maybe exponentially bearing that economic brunt, and opportunities are even further close off to you. But if you're a young person for whom we know peers and socializing and finding their community is so important, and armed groups in many ways provide ready-made community. If you're not able to meet your friends into the street, you're not able to join other organizations, and that part of your life has largely shut down, and armed groups like Boko Haram keep saying, well, this is a hoax, this is a Western attack, we are immune, and they're still meeting, and they said, we were praying shoulder to shoulder on Friday. They are still offering that opportunity. So I think there is a real question about what is happening right now, and what is the alternative for young people? What are we offering? Are we doing anything in this stimulus? Are we doing anything in our various policy interventions to make sure that not only there's continued opportunities, we are mitigating the effect of not having young people be able to connect with their friends and their peers. And also we're giving them a voice and an opportunity, and not just in a tokenistic way, in a real way. Like, what role do young people have in decision-making in society that is real, that validates their needs to have purpose in life, and that will actually have an effect on how we move forward? And if we're not offering that, and armed groups are, I think there's a real question about how we compete for the attention of young people and how we do prevention and do it well. So thanks so much for this question. I think it's really important.
Well, I love your answer. It was just amazing. It's so perfect. And I love that phrase that COVID has exacerbated the generational divides. It's, I think about my own children adapting far better to new measures like wearing masks to school than, say, my parents who resist it. And so I think that we have to also think about the way that they're adapting. Wonderful. Thank you so much. So Lausanne, do you have any final remarks you would like to share on that?
Yes, challenging time means a challenging way of working and finding mechanism and working on early warning indicators. But as Siobhan says and Achaleke earlier, I think it's the moment to dig into enhance the cooperation and engagement with local leaders and stakeholders, but also dig deep into what the social media, new communication assets. I mean, we need to focus on the new way of working, and then from that, trying to extract what will be the early warning mechanism we can find for children recruitment in area like Central Africa or Mali. So I think it's challenging for everyone how to get to those indicators and mechanisms, but we need to find ways, proper ways, and search it. And that's why Siobhan is here, and then look into best way to find those options. But it's challenging definitely for everyone. Yeah, even for boots on the ground. I mean,
yes.
Less and less patrol, less and less engagements, even if I'm advocating for engagement, but there is less and less of that. But again, we need, with that decrease, we need to find a way of keeping track of traditional mechanism, and then find new way of collecting.
Yeah, and that's really interesting, in thinking through ways that we might alter the way we do community engagement and controls, etc. Right? So there's a moment there of hope, especially if younger people are more connected to those tools, right? So Achaleke, I'm giving you the final word on this one, and I think it's most appropriate that it's you. So what is your response?
Well, I think that COVID-19 came with a lot of place a lot of check on what we have been having as health care and all of that, and how people have been leading. And one of the things that we saw, let me look at it from a conflict lens. What happened is that in the Anglophone regions, for example, the separatist groups, we're talking about the fact that, mask and, COVID is all, a hoax by government. Same thing in Boko Haram, context. But what we did as young people when it comes to responding, because, COVID-19 was not affecting only, people's lifestyle, it was also affecting peace and security, because as young people, as an organization, we asked ourselves 3 questions. Should we close and go home because everyone was going home and afraid? Should we continue what we used to do, or should we innovate to peace building? Because when you are afraid, it affects your inner peace. The Institute of Peace talks about this a lot. When inner peace is affected, you can easily demonstrate it through violence, especially in a context where there's poverty, when people cannot access, preventive materials, cannot access hospitals, especially in conflict zone. We saw situations where people became pharmacists who had never done pharmacy before because they want to produce sanitizer to sell.
Yeah.
Now, this is a whole niche for conflict to happen. The aging who don't have money, their kids don't have money, how do they get sanitizer? How do they get masks? What we did as our response, which comes back to responding, we launched an initiative called Operation One Person, One Hand Sanitizer. We transformed part of our office into a laboratory and mobilized young people from biomedical spaces, pharmacies, lab scientists, and we started producing sanitizer and giving it to communities for free. We were doing this because we had heard stories of how, violent extremist groups are doing this as a way to recruit people to show. But how do we counter this by a Facebook tweet, a post, or a Twitter, or talk about it in an article? Start doing something practice to give an alternative, to give a different narrative. We were able to do this. And today we've been able to produce 60,000 bottles of sanitizer and given to communities, even in the places where the separatists were saying they don't want to see anybody there. They don't want to see anyone wearing masks. We have been to the field, on the ground. And how did we get access? We got access because it was coming from young people. It was not any international or government. Young people who feel the same pressure. And today we produce masks using our prisonpreneurs. Inmates produce masks and give to communities, still building resilience, changing the narrative that be you a violent offender or not, you can respond to a global pandemic of this sort through being positive and showing that, transformation is possible. We were able to set up a call center to respond to trauma and mental related issues. And today, our impact, we have over 100,000 people who have benefited from this product for free. Now, this is the same thing that violent groups are doing to recruit. Now, I always said that what if the kind of attention which is given to ISIS and Al-Shabaab and Boko Haram is given to people who are building peace?
Yeah.
We'll have many, many more people who want to build peace. So my clarion call once more is that we need to shine the light. We need to support people who are resisting recruitment, who want to do things rightly, and people who are responding on the field, on the ground, tangibly, what you can touch and see and feel. It's very important. Thank you very, very much.
That is wonderful. Thank you so much for those final remarks. And certainly, I know that we have been working with journalists in places like South Sudan and the DRC, and I echo that too, that they have a responsibility also to shine light, as you've mentioned. Thank you to our panelists for this fascinating discussion today. It was truly a pleasure. I note that there are so many key takeaways today. Certainly, Achaleke closed with some incredibly important remarks there. Siobhan, your perspective in terms of COVID and the generational divides and thinking about identity and community, which also is something that Achaleke was highlighting extremely well from a youth perspective as well. And then to also think about, many of the challenges in terms of how we interact with various groups, be it policymakers in mission settings to aspects related to military and police and how they hear and see and understand the need for action to take place. But there is an important piece related to political will and to us changing the way that we order our priorities in this world. So thank you for this fascinating and engaging dialogue. Thank you to all of the speakers for making time to join us today, for sharing your valuable insights and allowing us to have a dialogue on how we can better incorporate early warning. And to all the participants who are joining us from around the globe, thank you for making time for this important discussion. As we have been saying all week, although we may not be able to see you, your presence is deeply felt. And it has been an incredible week full of discussions that have focused on what we can do better to protect children in fragile and conflict environments around the globe. From unpacking what a children, peace, and security agenda should be and how we can build that into practice, to considering how this children, peace, and security agenda connects to women, peace, and security and can augment and reinforce one another. We have also been thinking through how prevention mechanisms could be strengthened to better protect children around the globe, including the discussion we've had today on early warning as a critical aspect of these efforts. Our panelists this week have shown us again and again that children should not be isolated from the international peace and security agenda and should instead be seen as core to the success of any future that we all dream of. We cannot think about creating long-term conditions for sustainable peace without thinking about children today. And especially, I want to make sure that we emphasize the need to include and empower them to be agents of change, to be part of the design, to be part of the creation, to be part of the implementation. I think the youth speakers who have joined us this week have been wonderful examples of the importance of listening to the voices of young people and their perspectives. If I reflect back earlier in the week to Mira Allure, who was an alumnus of the Giants of Africa, she showed us that it is not age that makes the world go round, but it is ideas. And to protect children, we need to protect their ideas and their ability to create such ideas. On Tuesday, we heard from Aubrey Marie Cedar, who discussed the need for thinking through our collective efficacy and how this allows us together to have the power to fulfill our destinies, and through the use of innovative technologies and approaches like theater. On Wednesday, we heard from Baillie, and she spoke about EVE, Women's Development Organization in Juba, South Sudan. She so eloquently described that although barriers to inclusion still persist, women must be better reflected in how we think about peacekeeping and peace building, and that is an important part of how we can also work together to prioritize the protection of children. Yesterday, we heard from Abdikarim Hassan from the Elman Peace Center in Mogadishu, and he works on the front lines of addressing child protection in that country. And it was Abdikarim who so aptly noted that the suffering of children cannot be quantified, that it is up to adults to ensure that the perspectives of children are being listened to, and that they should not be seen as perpetrators of violence, but rather as victims and agents of positive change for the future. Today, Achaleke spoke so eloquently about some of the biggest challenges of mobilizing early warning into action, and his calls for the need to stop just looking at early warning systems, but how we actually put it into action practically. Certainly, the situation in Cameroon is a stark example for us all to look at about what we can do now to help young people be a part of that solution. And once again, thank you to all of our speakers for sharing your important insights throughout the entire week, for acting as change makers of today and tomorrow. And so moving forward, what can we do collectively from this symposium? We invite you all to join us in building and shaping a children, peace, and security agenda. Talk about it, reference it, talk to those in your family, talk to those you work with, share it in various forums that you participate in. We would also like to take a moment to invite you all to join our K4P community of practice, which is a network of practitioners, policymakers, and academics in the fields of early warning, child protection, and the prevention of the recruitment and use of children. The purpose of this network is to share knowledge, resources, and best practices on how to better support one another in our common mission to better protect children around the globe in conflict and fragile environments. And if you're interested in learning more about our community of practice, we will send you a correspondence to all of the symposium attendees and registration members who are here after this event to hear more and to certainly engage with us on that community of practice. And lastly, I'd like to close this week off with something that I believe is important for us to all remember, is that we need to stay positive and hopeful for the future. A well-known Canadian by the name of Buffy Sainte-Marie has written in a recent publication that it is better to light a candle than to curse the darkness. Thank you so much, and we hope to see you all in other forums.